Okay, welcome back, my rhetorical analysis friends. So I got a good one today for those of you that like to do some prompts that are not directly from the exam. This one's a good one. So I like looking at love letters when I am teaching the essence of pathos and ethos. So in early study of rhetorical analysis. And this piece right here is excellent for that. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor had a torrid relationship back in the day, and they split twice. And this is the letter that Richard Burton wrote in response to Elizabeth Taylor calling things off with him the very first time. This letter is difficult to find, so if you would like it, I can email it to you, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I'll have that posted at the end of this presentation as well. So teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I can send that text off to you. I had a hard time finding it on the internet, but it was something that I definitely wanted to use. So in this writing workshop, I will Bob Ross my instruction, meaning that I will give you plenty of exemplars and models so that you can use this with your students if you would like, and I'll show you how my templates can be used to construct the introductory paragraphs as well as the body paragraphs. And I'll show you a couple of different tricks that I have up my sleeve for rhetorical analysis. So here's the prompt. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor are two of Hollywood's biggest stars who met and fell in love on the set of Cleopatra in the 1960s when both were married to other people. Their affair caused an international scandal and led to a long and tumultuous relationship in the limelight. This 1973 letter was written by Burton after Taylor broke things off with him the first time around. They divorced a year later before remarrying and divorcing a second time. Read the passage carefully, write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Burton makes to convey his message. So this is actually a very tricky passage. His logical appeals are super subtle, and the way he gaslights and manipulates Taylor's heartstrings is pretty clever, and it's very heartfelt and very romantic. So students tend to not see everything that's going on in this. So it's a great piece to teach very close reading and some of the patterns that come up within the theory and the technique of rhetorical analysis over and over and over again. Because I find, my students find too, the more smaller text you read, it just becomes pattern, pattern, pattern. It's like, oh, there's parallel syntax again. There's a litany. There are rhetorical questions. There's anaphora, right? So they just begin to identify the patterns over and over again. And this one has many rhetorical features that will appear over and over again as they read and practice. So the immediate question is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, I'm going to tell you this. You can use the declarative or the inverted thesis every single time that you write an introductory paragraph, no matter the expository mode. But here's the kicker. For rhetorical analysis, the declarative model works best if you are going to get anchored in your terms and or devices. So come out with like the most relevant term and or device, like the most salient term or device, and get anchored in your thesis. So there are a couple of ways to do this. I'll show you how. And for those of you that are familiar with my templates for literary analysis, the cool thing is nothing really changes with rhetorical analysis. Within that prompt that I just read, and within every prompt that the College Board puts out for literary analysis or rhetorical analysis, implicit in every prompt are two essential questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? If students answer both of those questions in their introductory paragraph, they're going to crush their thesis, right, and come out of the gate with blazing speed, with a very solid foundation upon which to write the rest of the essay. So here are some things that I want my students to focus on. First, every introductory paragraph should be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. I want it to be exactly 4 sentences long. My students are well versed in sentence constructs in terms of manipulating their syntax. We use a text called Strunk and White's Write It Right. It's free online. Just type in Write It Right, Strunk and White, PDF, and you can find it. And in it, they make the assertion that there are 12 different ways to construct a sentence. And my students have a lot of practice. I do a lot of exercises with them so that they can manipulate a variety of sentence constructs to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow. I also do intensive word study academies with my students so that they have a pretty wide breadth of tier 2 level words. And by tier 2, I just mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. And so 4 sentences, tier 2 sentence constructs, and it's going to be thesis, context, and background. That's all that really needs to go in, and answer those 2 essential questions. So going into this piece, I asked my students, what are some of the high-flying rhetorical terms and or devices that you've seen in our reading thus far? And this is the list they came up with. And of course, there are others. They missed a few, like anaphora comes up a lot, allusion comes up a lot, and this is just what they're seeing, as rookies, as neophytes in the quest to perform rhetorical analysis. So they're getting it. They're chomping at the bit. So I do like to give them this list so that as they read, they can check off like the most prominent features in the piece. So here's the first one. And here's the kicker. So you can use your rhetorical terms and or devices, or you can omit them. This is one where the terms are omitted. And you're still going to answer the question, what is the authorial intent? And then the last question, how does the author construct meaning? So it's going to be 4 sentences, tier 2 sentence constructs, context, and background. So here it is. It has been said that one can never love someone as much as they can miss them. Right? What is the authorial intent? Boom, that's Burton's whole point, right? So what was his authorial intent? What was the main gist of him writing that letter? It has been said that one can never love someone as much as they can miss them. That's it. Further, the end of a relationship can also relate back to the old adage that one does not know what they have until it's gone. Endings can bring about a deep state of reflection that recognizes the grief of having lost as well as the appreciation of having had such a profound love. Now, how does he construct that meaning? Burton expresses these feelings through his tortured characterization and the inherent paradoxes of grappling with the termination of what appeared to him as a forever love. So that's one way to do it. All right, what is the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? So up top, those first 3 sentences is the context, background, heavy thematic focus. The last sentence is the thesis statement. So how do you construct meaning? So if you go this way, you're going the inverted route. Okay, so there's this gets a little tricky. So you can invert the thesis for rhetorical analysis if you go this approach. And then if you go with your terms and devices up top, you're going to declare. And that's what this one is. So a little trick that I have my students do is this. As you read, I tell them, find the 3 most salient rhetorical terms and devices in the piece, right? What are the 3 most salient terms and devices? And in your first sentence, lead with the most prominent, like the most essential term that constructs the meaning of the piece. And then you just sprinkle them in with context and background. Again, you're going 4 sentences. sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow. Got to get your tier 2 vocab in there for the academic voice. So it doesn't matter. Thesis can come up top or thesis can come at the bottom. So look at the difference here. With a tone wrought with jealousy and self-pity. All right, so I'll pause there. So you see how this student is making the assertion that his tone is the most essential term, right? Now, when my students identify tone, I always tell them to go with 2 tones because tone's not monolithic. You got to turn over the rock of this letter a few times, then identify a couple of the tones. And I always tell them try to at least get 1 tier 2 level word for the tone. Go with complexity, and self-pity is a very good identification of the tone, jealousy and self-pity. So this is really good. So from here, they got to sprinkle in the other 2 terms, right? So if they can ascertain a correct read, they're going to have a very solid thesis statement. So I'll take this from the top. With a tone wrought with jealousy and self-pity, Burton expresses his profound sense of loss as his relationship with Taylor comes to an end. Right? So how does he construct meaning? Emotionally heavy, so we got the pathos, perhaps even hyperbolically, he offers his parting words with a paradoxical twist of ego and insecurity. So focusing on the paradox and the pathos. While on one hand he elevates himself as being the perfect partner for Taylor, on the other hand he tears himself apart as being an inferior lover. And odd as it may seem, while at face value his words express an ending, he manipulates his diction to open what appears to be a closed door. Again, 4 sentences. What is the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? It does not matter. Thesis can come up top or thesis can come at the bottom. It really doesn't matter. So with my emerging and struggling writers, I like them to take this approach because, and I'm sure you've seen this in your career, right? Sometimes students get, at the end of their introduction, and AP readers know this all too well, and it's like, uh-oh, where's the thesis? So if they get anchored in their terms and devices, they pretty much guarantee themselves that they have a thesis as far as the extent to which they've, properly read the passage, right? You have to have an accurate interpretation of the piece. Otherwise, you're going to get kind of waylaid by your misreads and misinterpretations or lack of interpretation. So let's take a look at another one that looks like the first, right? What is the authorial intent? End with, how does the author construct meaning? And those of you that are familiar with how I teach literary analysis, so for all the genres, poetry, short stories, novels, and plays, this is the mode that I teach for literary analysis. So a lot of my students like consistency, and they say, what I do for literary analysis, I'm going to do for rhetorical analysis. So if you want one static, uniform template, this is the way to go. What is the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? So my students tend to prefer this just because they're creatures of habit, like most of us are. So start with authorial intent. When in the throes of love, thoughts of ending a perfect union are not entertained. But when everything falls apart, it is only then that the torturous self-examination begins. One is left to second guesses, even perhaps guilt, jealousy, and insecurity. Again, look at that sentence complexity there. That's really nice. Now look at this next one. Burton, through a series of interlocking paradoxes, characterizes himself as a man tortured by an ending. Always 4 sentences. Thesis up top, thesis at the bottom. Doesn't matter. Context background, tier 2 sentence constructs, right? So you kids come out of the box blazing speed when they can do this. And the good news is this. After a while, I don't need to focus on writing instruction all that much because I'm Bob Rossing the heck out of my instruction early in the academic year. So come time for the exam, these templates become so habitual, kind of innate, so intuitive, instinctual, and my students just write this way. So doing a 4-sentence introduction is not time consuming for them. They can crank these at ease because we've practiced it so many times. over the course of the year. And I know a lot of teachers just have their students write the one sentence introduction. I find those to be like dumping grounds of rhetorical terms and devices. I don't like it. So I think out of the gate, it's hard to get the pizzazz and the wow factor that something like this that dazzles and sparkles a little bit can yield that the student that extra point for the wow factor. So I prefer them going this way. So here's another one that looks like the second. So they're going to start with their terms. They're going to focus on the three most salient terms in the piece. So we're going to start with his characterization, his ethos. In considering his role in the breakup, Burton diminishes his sense of self while wallowing in self-pity. Now we're going to move to the tone, go two-tone words. With a tone that simultaneously borders upon arrogance and self-loathing, so have a tier 2 level word in the tone. He processes his anguish in coming to terms with Taylor's ending of their relationship. While at times giving a glum shoulder shrug, he also paradoxically mourns the loss of his love. Last sentence, how does Burton construct this meaning? What terms and or devices does he use to convey this theme? But what ultimately fuels his hyperbolic diction is his underlying jealousy that Taylor will move on without him. So again, it doesn't matter. You got a couple approaches here: declare, invert, context, background, sentence constructs, tier 2. Focus on the relevant, salient rhetorical terms and devices, and voila, out of the gate, you have a solid foundation upon which to write the rest of the essay. So you can practice both of those, but as I said to begin, to get your students to do this, you really have to position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom and Bob Ross the heck out of your instruction. Write with them, show them how to do this, because if you just talk about it in the ether, they're not going to be able to pull this off. So one of the things I do a lot early in the academic year is write a ton, but you're going to notice that it benefits you on the back end. The more I write, the less I have to grade. I actually decrease my grading load by writing so much. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather write than grade. So there's a benefit to this, many benefits to it. So we're at the body paragraphs. And again, for those of you that are familiar with my work, it doesn't matter the expository mode. It doesn't matter the text. You can always rock and roll with the syllogistic method. So for those of you that are new to my templates, I'll give you a real brief overview. Get into the YouTube channel and check out other videos that go over this more thoroughly so that you can incorporate it into your instruction with a little more depth and detail than what I'm going to provide now. So the syllogistic method comes from the Aristotelian tradition, and Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, by which the rich aristocratic boys would go to it, attend it, and they'd learn the art of polemics, debate, oration, and then, of course, the maths and the sciences. And they would have these big debates, and you have an example of one in the text Plato's Republic. So in Plato's Republic, the essential question of what is justice is thrown out. And all these great philosophical think tankers come to the podium and they say, this is what justice is. And then they'd huddle up and they would debunk that definition of justice. And at the end of this very long book of endless syllogism upon endless syllogism, they say, defining justice is really subjective and hard to do. So I guess it's of a personal nature what justice is. You define what justice is. But what Aristotle noticed at his school was that some of his students would systematically win the debates. Like they would offer forth these amazing ideas, full of textual support, full of textual analysis. And he said, why do some of my students have it, like the air quote, it, and others don't? And as writing instructors, we ponder the same thing. Why do some of our students come to us with this innate gift of the gab to be able to write these beautiful, eloquent essays? And then a lot of our other students just struggle. And It's a real arduous task to get them to eke out just a few sentences. And Aristotle said, I'm a good teacher. I can teach even my most struggling student to orate and debate with a certain degree of alacrity and ease and professionalism. I just have to give them a template. And one day he had his eureka moment and he said, ta-da, what my really good orators are doing is arguing syllogistically. And what he meant by that was there's like a mathematic approach to logic. And he said, all it is you got to argue from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, we'd be like, yes, that's true. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. In the conclusion, we're going to say, uh-oh, your dog's going to die, right? That's a cogent argument there. That's a clear delineation of a line of reasoning. And when our students write, we want them to have that line of reasoning. And this template affords them the opportunity to do that. So in terms of what the template looks like syllogistically for rhetorical analysis is simply this. We have to remember that rhetorical analysis is an expository mode. So they have to argue. So in the first premise, they have an argument containing rhetorical terms and or devices. Here's the kicker with the first premise. I tell my students the rule from FRQ 1 on the Lang exam. Your argument must be central every time you write an expository essay. Right? I wish the College Board would give that rule for everything, but I think we'd see less plot summary from our students. So you can't begin by just retelling the love letter, the story of the love letter. You're analyzing it. You're doing a rhetorical analysis of it. So I like my students to take 3 sentences to set up that argument and get anchored in their terms and devices. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. The second premise, I like to see a teeter-totter balance of support or of quoting and paraphrasing. It's the textual support. You don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other. And as you'll see in a second, I really moved my kids away from doing those gargantuan quote dumps that we see when we look at sample papers that the College Board puts out. That's not skillful. We want them to avoid doing that. And then the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph. And I want to really clarify that. I'm not talking about the conclusion paragraph. I'm talking about the conclusion of the paragraph. So you have to conclude each paragraph. So a syllogism is going to be one paragraph. So you have to have your textual analysis. And then I always tell my students that the first premise is a promise. You got to make sure that you kept your promise and that you have sustained your line of reasoning. And then you echo the thesis statement in the end there. So students ask me this all the time. They're like, Mr. Kuhn, since introductions are 4 sentences long, and the syllogistic body paragraph is a template, just like declarative or inverted, you must have a magic number of sentences that you want to see in a syllogistic body paragraph. And I'm like, I do. I think to have enough support and analysis, the magic number is 10 sentences. You're shooting for 10, somewhere in that ballpark. And I put a hard cap at 12 sentences because otherwise they're just going to blow V8 and probably switch into, like something that reads like a Cliff Note summation. It's too plot heavy. Line of reasoning's broken. They digress and get tangential. So hard cap at 12, shoot for 10. So this is an example here. Students ask this as well. How do I begin my first body paragraph? And I tell them, start where Burton starts. Start where the author starts. Read the passage, and what's the first rhetorical move that Burton makes? And that's your first sentence for your body paragraph, your first body paragraph. So again, it's going to be 3 sentences long, and start where Burton starts. So you have this transition here right from the onset. So you're cueing your reader into knowing that you have a chronology, you have a sequential sequencing for this. And then you're going to focus on rhetorically, what does Burton do? Because you're doing rhetorical analysis, so you don't want to switch to plot summation. You're not doing plot analysis. And if we look at College Board sample papers, that's the main snafu. That's the pitfall. Kids immediately begin to retell the story of the love letter. We don't want to do that. So 3 sentences to set up the argument. Look what happens here. Right from the onset, Burton expresses the paradox of his laws. So we're going to focus on paradox. His salutation is both a term of endearment, or in other terms, a pet name given to Taylor, but in the same breath, he notes the shock of having lost her. So we're going to get into the paradox of the diction. Oddly, he also simultaneously inflates his ego while groveling in self-deprecation. So we made a promise here to the reader, because the first premise is a promise. We promise, dear reader, that we're going to discuss the paradox and the ethos in here. All right, and then of course we're going to get into the diction. The second premise automatically does that. So ethos and paradox. We can bring in other things quickly, if it's in the periphery of our read, but we can't break this line of reasoning and go talk about an extended metaphor or something like that, because it's not promised in the first premise. We'd break the line of reasoning if we were to do that. So we're guaranteeing our reader that we're going to hit ethos and paradox, and we can bring in bit parts, but quickly. We can't go off on a major digression of some other aspect. So all the quotes and paraphrasing needs to be germane to the promise. So you have to quote with deliberation. So since in the first premise, I'm starting where Burton starts, when I start the second premise in the fourth sentence, I'm going to draw from early up top of the letter, right? Go sequentially, go chronologically. That's a training wheel that helps students stay logical and cogent. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of where Burton starts. Immediately, he refers to Taylor as his lumps, clearly a playful name he once gave her as a term of affection. So I tell my students, fourth sentence begins the second premise, start quoting. Go get the best quote for your first rhetorical move. But in the very next line, it's as if he suddenly awakens and notices that she's off by God. So, all right, we're good. We're in the paradox. We promise paradox. We're getting paradox. The exclamatory sentence is his first stroke of hyperbole. But then he veils his feelings with an exaggerated sense of self-loathing mixed with sheer arrogance. As if in disbelief, he acknowledges that he can barely believe it since he is so unaccustomed to anybody leaving him. So let's talk about this, because these quote transitions sound silky smooth, right? These are embedded, really well embedded. And there's a simple rule for this. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words, so not exactly, a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, keeps the quote small and brackets as needed, they should sound conversational. So you see my students using brackets in this. So that needs to be taught, and it keeps it conversational. We don't want quote dumps. So all these quotes are germane to the ethos and the paradox. So our line of reasoning is perfect so far. There's that teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. We're cruising here. And again, you're going to focus on the tier 2 and the sentence constructs, just as we did in the introduction. Taylor is the first woman to have ever called things off with him, and Burton's processing of this reveals a lot about his character. He, upon deep reflection, wonders why nobody did so before. This mix of inflation and deflation leads to what is really bothering Burton, his fear and jealousy that Taylor will move on and couple with another man. So this is fair game. We're getting into the paradox, which by extension gets into his ethos. All right, so all of this is tied together. Line of reasoning super intact. So we go on to the next slide. I ran out of space there. This is still the same syllogism, same body paragraph, even though it's a new slide. He says one thing but means the opposite when he comments that he don't much care who she'll find happiness with, but hoping Taylor will follow his lead, he feels compelled to tell her that he will not have affairs with any other female. All right, this is really sticking to a line of reasoning here. All right, the promise is kept. All the quotes need to be germane. All the paraphrasing needs to be germane to that promise. It's an umbrella concept. So it's quote, analyze, paraphrase, analyze, right? So you weave in the support and the analysis simultaneously. So no quote dumping. You can't just drop a quote and run away from it. And I'm sure you tell your students that a lot. That's one of the things they're guilty of often. So we quoted, let's go analyze it. In effect, Burton is being manipulative. As if guilt-tripping Taylor, he informs her that while she may be pursuing other men, he shall gloom a lot and stare morosely into unimaginable distances. All right, so we have lots of support in there. We quoted a few times, we paraphrased a few times. That's plenty of support. We've shown the ethos, the paradox, right? We got a lot in there. Like, we got a lot covered. We got some of the essential terms and devices covered in there through our quoting and paraphrasing, and we've kept the promise. In the conclusion, go shake hands again with that first premise. This just takes a couple of sentences and echo the thesis. Like in the conclusion, you always want to go back to the thesis. Make sure you're hammering the prompt. The paradoxes really are not so paradoxical when one reads between the lines. Burton's diction is a veiled attempt to open what appears to be a closed door. And in the end, his desperate arrogance yet again comes to the forefront in the shape of a knowing hopefulness that Taylor will return to him once again. It took 11 sentences, right? So that's a full, articulate, cogent, very deliberate line of reasoning syllogism from start to finish. And kids can do that all day long as they practice this template, right? It takes you, Bob Rossing it, them practicing it, lots of reading practice, and they can do this all day long come time for the exam. So if you would like the letter that Burton sent to Elizabeth Taylor, email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I can send that to you, and I can send this exact same PowerPoint to you if you choose to use it with your students in your own writing workshop. So the other thing that I've been saying in groups, the AP groups, and then my own Facebook group, is that Tim Freitas, that awesome dude from the Garden of English, and I are sitting down to collaborate on a textbook together. And to gather my data for that, my teacher data and student data, I'm offering something that I'm calling the Teach It Right 5-Week Mastermind, where I want to work with just a handful of teachers over a 5-week period. We're going to meet every Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for 5 consecutive weeks. And I'm going to help these teachers incorporate my templates into their classroom. I'll work with the teacher and the students and see what kind of maturation and growth occurs in the writing. And then I'm going to use that data in the textbook. So if you'd like to be a guinea pig for the textbook, email me there and we can talk specifics and maybe get you on board if you're a good fit. So I'm looking for like super high energy, high engagement teachers that are gung-ho to try some new strategies out in their classroom. So that's it for now. I hope you found this to be useful and can use it with your students as an alternative to just doing straight up test prep with your kids. And for now, happy writing, happy teaching.